Professor Fernandez?
Hi, good morning from the Philippines. It's still 11:24 a.m. here, and I'm so glad to meet all of you. And I thank you for this opportunity that amidst this pandemic, which is very difficult, especially here in Philippines. So I'm really thankful for this conference. Yes. And I am recently the Dean of Agriculture of the Rizal Memorial Colleges, and from here in the Philippines, in my region in Davao City. And I've been working overseas for 2 years ago, and this pandemic has been a tremendous experience for me. So I'm really glad to talk about it. So once again, thank you, and hello, everyone.
Advocate Basu?
This is Basu from Calcutta. I am practicing in Calcutta High Court for the last 25 years. And my area of specialization is service matters, constitutional matters, and to some extent environment matters. And I express and convey my deep sense of gratitude to the organizer who have given me this opportunity to share my views with the persons who are armed with cerebral electricity. It is my opportunity to become a more enlightened person. Thank you very much.
Professor Basu?
Hello, everyone. This is Saikat Basu calling from India. I'm the Executive Research Director of Performance Seed, overlooking crop production services and development in Western Canada. I am located in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. Right now, I am visiting India and is currently serving as the visiting faculty of the Department of Botany at the Calcutta University. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Thank you very much.
Professor Sebastian? Dr. Sebastian? Unmute yourself, please.
Sorry. Once again, I'm Nancy Sebastian. So I started working in Singapore 2 years back, teaching various economics and social science subjects. So Sanghamitra happens to be my friend from JNU, and thank you for inviting me here. Also happy to be here and sharing my insights about political practices during COVID. It's a great platform and looking for more such opportunities. And nice to meet you all.
Professor Saha?
Hi, everyone. Am I audible, I guess?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks to Professor Nath. She's my friend and she's my, from Zajdow itself. And I'm really happy to be in this particular meet. I'm working in Calcutta in a government college as an assistant professor since last six and a half years or something like that. And I'm also completing my PhD from JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And mainly my work is on agriculture related issues, as in like agrarian economy, rural economy, and so on and so forth. And yeah, thanks for this platform, and nice to meet you all in this time of pandemic. Thank you.
So it was great, knowing each other. Okay, we now have exactly 3 minutes and exactly at 2 minutes left, actually. I have with me here an extra option, which you don't have, which is broadcast. So once I press broadcast, the attendees will be able to see us. And I have enabled in this chat for attendees to write comments. And if at all questions, actually they should write questions in this Q&A option. But if they still choose to write here in the chat box, it's fine. We'll be able to see and take them up. Anything else that you would like to clarify, or anything at all? We still have 2 minutes more to go. 1 minute more to go.
This is like one of my classes. I've just finished. It's like, can't start until it's exactly right on time. No early. Can't do that.
It's 9 o'clock and we start our panel session now. I want to welcome everyone to today's panel session. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to TASA 2020 panel session on social trust and political practices in the new normal. I'm Sanghamitra, the panel session organizer and the chair for this session today. Let me quickly outline for the audience, as I can see that there are already attendees. So for the audience, let me quickly lay out the format of today's session. Every speaker will be allotted 12 minutes to present their paper, and the next 3 minutes will be spent on short question and answers, where panelists will ask questions to the speaker. And at the end of 10 minutes, the speaker will be told that just 2 minutes are left. And at the end of those 2 minutes, the speaker will be told that the time is up. After the end of the panel discussions, the remaining 20 minutes would be spent on question and answers with the general audience. The audience is requested to put their questions in the Q&A option available on their toolbar. And this panel session is being live streamed on YouTube. To all the audience, I hope you can see in the chat box the YouTube live stream link. I'm extremely sorry for the last minute technical glitch which led to the change in the YouTube live stream link. Please take note of this link, and whoever you wish to share it with, please go ahead and share it. So let me quickly give a brief overview of what this panel session is about. In this panel session, we will discuss what happens when social trust in the new normal, where governments across the world have implemented innumerable programs, policies, and laws to control COVID-19. In the context of government actions and political leadership to tackle the pandemic, what becomes of social trust? To explore this issue, we have in the panel 8 eminent speakers. We have Louis Kriesberg, Maxwell Professor Emeritus of Social Conflict Studies, Syracuse University, New York, USA. Grazyna Zajdow, Associate Professor, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Deakin University, Victoria, Australia. Saikat Kumar Basu, Executive Research Director, Performance Seed, Lethbridge, Canada. Greg Martin, Associate Professor, School of Social and Political Sciences, University of Sydney, Sydney, Australia. Alminda M. Fernandez, Dean, College of Agriculture, Rizal Memorial Colleges, Davao City, Philippines. Kallol Basu, Advocate, High Court, Kolkata, India. Nancy Sebastian, Sessional Lecturer, University of Newcastle, Suntec City, Singapore. And Atrey Saha, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Muralidhar College, Kolkata, India. So we'll begin with Professor Kriesberg's presentation. Professor Kriesberg. Professor Kriesberg.
I do share.
Okay, okay. Okay,
Okay, I guess that's the first slide.
Okay, great.
Okay, we've got the adjustment. And let's go right to the second one.
Great.
I'm struck that all the countries are unique and the new normal will vary from one place to another. So I don't think there's going to be a universal new normal, just as there wasn't a universal normal prior to the COVID-19. The concept of social trust is one that has been of interest in sociologists for a very long time. But we seem to differ as to what we're talking about. Safety and security from others, or the honesty and belief that the others will act correctly. Sometimes it's about others referring to people generally or certain groups, and particularly the national government. And obviously the different questions get different results. The next slide. I'm just going to run through a few poll findings from the US particularly. And on the whole, you can see that there is not much trust in the government of the United States by its citizens. I remember shortly after World War II, reading that the trust generally in the United States was much wider and much more positive than most other countries. And we have seen a decline. This is what it looks like currently from an Associated Press poll. Next slide. But I think what is particularly revealing when you begin to look at some social variations for different segments of the population. If you look on the left, you see the whites are much more trusting than blacks. It varies by age, with older people being more trusting, and that may be a generational shift that we're seeing, or it may be because as anybody gets older, they're more confident. Marriage makes a little difference. Income is highly related. The more income you have, the more trusting you can find people. And finally, the kind of area you live in, whether it's rural or urban, and as we would expect, urban people are less trusting, and that may be relevant to the shift towards less trust as America and many other countries are becoming more urban. Next slide. So here is some reference to the trends. The National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago has been doing surveys on what they call confidence in government and other institutions. And pretty generally, there has been a decline in most institutions over the decades. For the government, NORC compared Congress, the executive branch, Supreme Court, and the military. Congress has very low trust or confidence. Okay, next slide. So there are a few other things which are related to the trend towards decreasing trust, almost whichever way you measure it. One thing that I think is quite striking is inequality. The more unequal, the less trust. Singapore is apparently one where it's low. There's high inequality and low trust. And Scandinavian countries are relatively equal, and there's a high trust. For the United States, and I imagine most other countries, scandals are the things that reduce trust in the government, and we have had our share of scandals. And with each one, there is certainly a lowering, if it's a national scandal of the government, a reduction of trust. But I want to also emphasize the Republican Party ideology, particularly beginning with, well, throughout its modern existence, but particularly beginning in the 70s, end of 70s with Ronald Reagan. It was clear that the New Deal was a grab at government power, and it meant regulation and taxes to pay for services. And the Republican Party said this was bad. They were against high taxes, particularly for the rich. They attacked large government for being big and wanted to shrink it. This was a straightforward, very firm part of the ideology, and they pretty constantly would denigrate anything that a federal government would try to do. There is also some evidence, some research about an increase in materialist values among youth, and that's associated with low trust. Okay, next slide. Okay. What we had with the presidency, and I can say this in the past tense. What we had with the presidency of Donald J. Trump was certainly an anti-government presentation, and such what captured some Republican Party support, and he had some following, never the majority of the people in the election that chose him. But the coming of COVID was really a test. That could have been something which would unite the people and give them faith in their government if that was handled by the national government in an effective fashion, or at least in a serious fashion. But that was not the case. From the outset, he played it down, didn't take it too seriously, and then throughout, kind of abdicated engagement and left it more and more to the cities and states, particularly in a federal union, say they're the responsible ones. But without a national ordering of it and taking it seriously, what he ended up doing, I think, was to increase the distrust in the national government. And he did so in a variety of ways. I got some of the usual listing of his failings, that he lied about the seriousness of the pandemic. He undermined public health guidance to people, partly out of his own disinterest in science, because he made up his facts in terms of what his prejudices were and his own gut, as he would say. And he failed to take responsibility. The result was considerable incompetence as people competed against each other to get the medical materials that they needed. The states were pitted against each other, the cities were pitted against each other, and people were pitted against each other. At the same time, he was making false charges that he was being attacked all the time by the deep state, some fantastic organization of the federal government out to get him, because he was running as somebody against the swamp. This played well with some people for a variety of reasons, including Republican ideology, if you don't want a big government, for the evangelicals. He promised them a Supreme Court which would get rid of abortion availability. And overall, he simply placed his personal concerns and benefits above those of the country. Next slide.
Professor Kriesberg, I'm sorry to interrupt, but 10 minutes are up. You have 2 minutes left.
But he brought, and what he did, I think, incited mistrust among the people, Blacks, Jews, Muslims. He raised fears of crime and disorder. He opened more acceptance to false information and modeled uncivil language. Next slide. You can see that the American people on the whole wanted more trust and thought that the mistrust that had grown up increasingly was a problem. Next slide. And as a result, he was defeated in an election, and the next day there were celebrations across the country. Next slide. And I just want to close with saying that it ain't all lost. There are positive developments that were going on all the time. There was resistance to some of the things that Trump was doing. There is growing acceptance of African Americans, and the Black Lives Matter was popularly joined in a very diverse fashion. The increasing role of women in society, I think, would lead to behavior and understanding which would be more trustworthy than the belligerency of some males. And I would like to say, I think there has been growing acceptance of ideas of a constructive conflict, about conflict waged in a way which is thoughtful and seeking and finding mutual benefits. So I think with some profound policy goals can be set, and I must say that I think the new administration, Biden-Harris, has made it clear that resilience towards global warming and reducing the inequality are things that we can all unify around and benefit by having such important overall goals. And all that takes is actions by many people, by the national government, and I'm heartened by what we've seen already by Biden and Harris, picking out those two things I just mentioned, which I must say I had picked out before knowing what he was going to say today, or as he indicated in the appointments that he made. But lastly, it requires action by many people at many levels. I think one benefit of the response to COVID-19 was the greater activity and engagement by the states and by the cities, and they are closer to people, and more people are engaged with them. And finally, there are the many non-governmental movements and organizations. America's always been known for the activity of voluntary associations. That's been our hallmark. And even though it may be weaker at times, I think it's revived and stronger than ever at the national and the local government levels of the country. I could go on and mention their examples, but I don't want to go over my 20 minutes. So I want to end with that hopeful new normality, which I think we can accomplish.
Thank you so much, Professor Kriesberg. Professor Kriesberg made it very clear how the shortcomings of the United States President, Donald Trump, led to the failure of administration on multiple grounds, which caused widespread distrust in the government. We were also informed how one could build trust in the American democracy and amongst the American people. Thank you so much once again, Professor Kriesberg. Let me now request panelists if they have any questions for Professor Kriesberg. Any questions for Professor Kriesberg? No questions for Professor Kriesberg? Okay, in which case then I'll request Professor Zajdow to make her presentation. Professor Zajdow.
Okay, thank you. I'll just get my presentation up. Where am I? I need to share the screen. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm going to read because otherwise I will just go dreadfully over time. This presentation takes the outline of the panel and questions its assumptions in many ways. Using the example of Victoria under lockdown and the moral panic, and I say that quite specifically over suicide spikes that have just not occurred, it takes up Moll & Law's studies of complexities to argue that there is little evidence of a fall in social trust in Victoria. I take up Professor Kriesberg's point that it's not universal and can't be universal. So the question, the quote from Moll & Law is that there is complexity if things relate but don't add up. If events occur but not within the processes of linear time, and if phenomena share a space but cannot be mapped in terms of a single set of three-dimensional coordinates. But they do recognise that they don't want to be seen as reductive, and so they say, so the questions they ask are, how might complexities be handled in knowledge practices non-reductively but without at the same time generating ever more complexities until we submerge in chaos, which is one of the things that I feel about some of the mapping processes that have been happening in Australia lately. So this paper is the first attempt to do this. So I started. This is a news item. There was a famous video in August in Victoria of a pregnant woman being arrested over organising online a demonstration against Victoria's COVID lockdowns and her later media interviews, in which she said she was sick of the quote, the suicides and people losing their jobs. And this was the catalyst about my thinking about this. I was wondering what was going on. Because around the same time, an acquaintance was posting information about isolation and the number of suicides caused by the COVID situation. And she quoted some figures. Her figures came from a commercial news item that used modelling from the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. And it was actually in response to this that it was on the same day that the Victorian State Coroner publicly stated there had been no rise in suicides in Victoria. The claim that there had been this rise was just not true. Rather than the 2,100 deaths claimed by the news items that my friend had seen, Victoria had recorded about 450 suicides in the previous 12 months, which was a similar total to the year before. And importantly, no increase from April to August, which was the time of the lockdown. And as a matter of fact, figures released last week from the coroner to the end of October show a similar pattern. In fact, the 10 months to October 2020 indicate 580 deaths from suicide. In Victoria, 20 fewer than the previous year. That so many of the figures emanated from academic sources was the impetus for me to start looking at the current vogue of modelling and the issues around complexity and simplicity, particularly modelling of human behaviour. How is it possible that the models tell us we should be killing ourselves at great rates, and instead we are choosing to be staunch and stay alive? Perhaps part of the answer lies in the process of modelling. The models are by their nature complex, but their complexity is actually intended to simplify the modern world. They are a form of risk management or risk assessment, and they are used as the basis for some sort of action. In this case, the prevention of self-harm or suicide. The models have so many inputs and scenarios that it becomes impossible to work out the type of action needed to minimize the risk. But they demand action because their very reason to be is to tame these chaotic events. So we take complex models and attempt to produce a linear model for action. But the current figures on suicide completely undermine the logic. How is it possible that while presentations of self-harm and suicidal ideation have increased, and that looks like that's what's happening in hospitals, the final steps towards suicide, to actual carrying out, have not? In this way, I started thinking about Bauman's argument that an answer to this conundrum might be that we rely on rationality. And this rationality leaves us in an ambivalent situation, because in the effort to enforce it, it becomes reductive. Everything becomes reduced to its logic. And the logic of the Brain and Mind Centre's report is worthwhile unpicking. So this is the title page and one page from the report. In May 2020, the Brain and Mind Centre released a short report called Sounding the Alarm. This was a modelling exercise for the New South Wales North Coast Primary Health Network on the possible scenarios related to mental health presentations in emergency departments, suicide attempts and suicide deaths. Importantly, it used the unemployment rate as the main driver of actions such as suicide attempts and deaths. It's not unreasonable because the historical evidence shows that's exactly true, that unemployment plays a major role in both. The report argued that a best case scenario would see an increase of suicide deaths of 23% and a worst case scenario an increase of 53%. In late July, the same institution released a larger and much more detailed report of similar modelling for the whole of Australia. While acknowledging that national averages were likely to be different to regional ones, this model forecast an increase in suicides of 13.7% over the next 5 years. So if the model is accurate, the scenario forecasts almost 20,000 completed suicides in the next 5 years in Australia, 2,100 more than might have happened otherwise. So here we get the figure where the news item came from, that over the next 5 years, not currently, what will the possible events might be 2,100 more suicides. And so I argue the attempt by the Brain and Mind Centre to sound the alarm, as the title of the report, created a moral panic. And this is a conundrum for me. the modelling of potential suicides in the report uses some of the actual experience of unemployment and suicide to underscore its figures, but it completely omits the sociological and historical understanding of a community's reaction to a major social event such as a war or pandemic. Durkheim argued that major historical events such as war or dramatic social change, like bushfires, which is what we had earlier in the year in Australia, actually provided an impetus to social cohesion that meant suicide rates would go down. Now, I'm not arguing that suicide rates have gone down because 20 here or there is not the point, but perhaps we need to think about what sociology tells us happens when things go bad. Durkheim's classic tale of state of anomie is very close to what these two reports do suggest happens to young people who are not attached to employment or education. It is this feeling of exclusion and lack of community that would drive some to consider self-harm. But I think that that's very different to the moral panic around people who are, it's being argued, are isolated at home under lockdown conditions and therefore more likely to commit suicide. There does not seem to be any recognition that technology has changed the way many people do their socializing. It is clear, it's clearly not the same thing that physical human interaction is the same as socializing online. I wouldn't make that argument ever. However, and that loneliness is a very real emotion at the moment. It's clear that that's the case. These conditions do not necessarily add up to mental illness, as is claimed by many advocates. And the next step then is self-harm or suicide. These are social conditions that need social change, clearly. And to their credit, the Brain and Mind Centre reports state clearly that the most effective strategies to prevent a rise in suicides and self-harm are employment policies. Makes perfect sense, really. Attachment to the community, a feeling of responsibility for others, and a sense of being part of a wider social world are fundamental to human satisfaction. They recognise that. But they have also produced these reports that claim that suicide by its nature has to go up. And it doesn't look like it's happening. The groups, and I would argue that the groups whose raison d'etre is to maintain the public's vision on issues such as mental illness are competing in a very crowded room. And they have to scream very loudly to be heard. This existed, the state that happened before the COVID epidemic. These groups need to yell to make sure that we are scared enough to take notice of them. I don't blame them. They are competing with many other groups whose interests involve the poor, the dispossessed, and the disadvantaged. And all these groups know that they cannot rely on the state to deal with them equitably. We know that that's the case.
Professor Zajdow, I'm sorry to interrupt, but 10 minutes are over.
2 minutes, okay, thank you. Mental health groups need to be aware and take note of how they might play into the hands of the conspiracy theorists who wish to undermine state responses to the pandemic, as happened with the case of the woman quoted at the top of this paper. She came and was involved in a number of groups that were part of the major conspiracy, the anti-vaccination and various other conspiracies. It seems to me misguided, though, on the part of the Brain and Mind Centre to entitle a report "Sounding the Alarm" and think that no aspect of the highly networked and technological society in which we live will use it for purposes far from the benign ones intended. Their screaming has led to intense political pressure to open up economies and undermine the measures taken to halt the pandemic. It has also added to the anti-5G, anti-vaxxer, sovereign citizen conspiracists' arsenal of claims. That's so sibilant. Regardless of the fact that we are not killing ourselves because of the lockdown. We may be unhappy and lonely, but that is a very rational response to the situation we find ourselves in. And I'm almost finished. It is hard to tell what COVID normal looks like, and I would not consider that the case of Victoria can be used as a general example. This would simplify the situation to a ridiculous degree. However, what we do know is that even with the moral panic caused by the mental health advocates and the various conspiracy groups, support for the state government has been very high. It seems to have held up even with constant criticisms by the state opposition and the federal government. The governing Labor Party would win at this moment with an increased majority, and the Premier's approval rating is over 70% in a poll released in November. And yesterday, there was a new poll from this called the Ethics Index that has found that all professions and industries in Victoria are up in their ethical index. So more people in Victoria now trust those institutions, even through what we've been through, including governments and even, as they say, real estate agents. So I will finish this by saying what becomes really clear is at this moment in Victoria, the old Durkheimian argument that social cohesion is something that happens with an external danger actually seems to have happened. It feels like we are all in this together, and regardless of our unhappiness, we actually seem to be pulling through it reasonably well. So that's where I leave it for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zajdow. It was very well explained that the likelihood of mental illness and self-harm was understood without taking into account the sociological reality, and that Professor Durkheim's understanding of social cohesion was also proved during this pandemic. Thank you once again, Professor Zajdow. Any questions for Professor Zajdow from the panelists?
Oh, yeah. So thanks for that. It's really interesting, and it relates to some of the things that I'll be talking about as well in relation to anime, although I haven't framed it in that kind of way. So I was just wondering about your concept of moral panic. Moral panics are accompanied by the creation of folk devils. So in your model or in your argument, where would be, who would be the folk devils? The moral entrepreneurs, I think you're saying, would be the mind and so on and so forth, mind and brain trust. But where the missing component seems to me is the folk devil.
Yes, and it's actually you argue it isn't a folk devil. It's either the COVID itself, which is not a thing, not a live thing anyway. But also it is aimed at, interestingly enough, governments for closing down the economy. Most of it was around closing down the economy, and I think that my argument is that's not the intention of the Brain and Mind Centre or any of the other advocates. What they want to do is to maintain pressure on governments to produce the policies and the money that's necessary to help people through, but it is used by other parts, particularly right-wing media and right-wing groups, to hammer the state government. So I think that they're the meat and the sandwich rather than anything else.
So ironically, in Stan Cohen's original model, with the government and politicians were the sort of moral entrepreneurs. Now, in some senses, your kind of argument sees them almost as the sort of the devils, the demonized.
In this case, yes, I think that's true. I mean, I wouldn't make it a more general sense, but yes, I think a lot of the moral entrepreneurs these days are people who we would see as, rather than right-wing or conservative, on the left, but they need to get the interest, and that's what they do, unfortunately.
Any more questions from panelists for Professor Zajdow? Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Zajdow, Professor Martin. Now we'll go to Professor Basu's presentation. Professor Basu.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My presentation, I do not have a PowerPoint slide by the time, and I'll be just talking about the socio-political challenges of the new normal from a Canadian perspective. Hopefully, I'll be able to highlight a few of the key challenges that are being faced by Canada as a country. As you may know that it's the second largest country in the world, Canada, after Russian Federation, with around a bit over 33 million in population over a vast land. which has very little population, and most cities and towns are closed within 200 kilometers of the United States border with Canada. Now, the country has always been dependent on United States as its major trade alliance, and at the same time, three of its primary trade alliances are right now, other than Europe, is United States, China, and India. Now, prior to the pandemic, Canada was already going through a downturn in economy. Currently, the government is held by the Liberal Party, and the Prime Minister is that handsome Honorable Justin Trudeau. And he is the son of the legendary Pierre Trudeau, the previous Prime Minister of Canada. But although there was a high expectation that Trudeau will transform economy, but overall the feeling was that he's a very nice, sociable person, very interactive, very soft and kind-hearted, but actually has no administrative experience. Like, he was a teacher, and because of the son of an illustrious father, was pumped up to the very high position of the Prime Minister by the Liberal Party with very little experience about administration. So his first term was okay, but like a vast majority of Canadians didn't like Trudeau's administration and his handling of various international issues, where we believe that most of the time Canadian retrospective Canadian side of the talks were like taking a very in all trade deals with the European Union, India, Canada, China, or United States. The new NAFTA trade that came in with Trump was heavily, we feel it's heavily in favor of the United States. Although Trudeau has been viewed as a person who's very nice, but believe in sweeping challenging problems under the carpet and going mostly for appeasement politics. But prior to the pandemic hitting, Canada already had their election, and Trudeau's government was reduced to a virtual minority with very little authority now in passing suitable bills to make into laws, and is dependent on the opposition. But at the same time, strangely, none of the other parties were interested in taking the hot seat because it's a pandemic time and no one wants to be identified as a bad administrator. So Trudeau was back in position. Canada was really down in economy, was going through corruption and other related political fights within the Canadian Parliament, and was completely underprepared with respect to facing the pandemic. The initial WHO warnings were grossly underestimated. Canada has a world-class health facility, and it's all social care. It's all paid by the government from the taxes. And because of its world-class infrastructure, it was believed that the pandemic won't be impacting Canada in that way. It will be same like an influenza or a winter flu or a summer flu kind of a stuff. So it was so grossly underprepared that when the pandemic hit Canada, it was a worse situation as would have been in Europe. The initial round of schools and universities and colleges and offices were kept open for a quite considerable period. In spite of the serious warning, the US border was kept open for a very, very long time. And there was cross migration of people from one country into another. When US was having such a severe pandemic, Canada kept all the border open with very little limitation and restrictions at the time of initial screening. And we paid the price for this. And even when now the border is closed or restricted or monitored through Alaska and other parts, there has been people infiltrating into the Canadian territories, and the government has not been able to handle the situation quite efficiently. So there was resentment about the government because the hospitals were getting overloaded. The health workers were beyond their ability to handle such a high influx of patients. And what was sad, because of this huge influx of COVID patients, normal treatments like cancer, radiation treatment, dialysis, children's hospitals, every single other areas were getting impacted. And this led to a lot of resentment and a lot of bad feelings among Canadians regarding the capability of the government in handling the situation. However, the pandemic varied across the provinces from west to east. It's a vast, huge country, and geographical isolation helps in a bit compared to other countries in keeping infection levels at some base. So northern, the polar Canada was more or less virtually untouched, while other provinces in the south adjoining the United States were more impacted. And travel restrictions, or international travel restrictions, came in quite late into Canada. And that's how, like, infected people who came into Canada were unfortunately responsible for spreading the infection. And the government didn't take a very strong action in restricting people or enforcing laws in lockdowns in the beginning. And what it was appealing to the people was that every individual should be responsible and they should stay at home and should follow the quarantine. But there was no really comprehensive lockdown policy for the country. And the government dilly-dallied on that. And the infection spread, and then it turned into a havoc. Although it was not as bad as United States or other European countries at that point of time, and through the effort, like, I do not know how to thank our health workers. They have worked round the clock 24/7 to handle the situation. We're able to flatten the curve in several provinces. But Canada has this big challenge of appeasement politics and intra-party political fights. So they were trying, every different province came up with different legislations and rules and regulations. Did not, although the international travel was restricted, but traveling between the provinces was not restricted. And there was difference of opinion between the federal and the provincial government, and everyone wanted to try and look good. So they didn't restrict interprovincial travel quite efficiently. And right now, Canada is going through the second wave. Our health workers were very, very successful in flattening the curve, but with winter, and Canadian winter is harsh, as everyone knows, is impacting back with a second and a third wave of pandemic hitting in every corner of the populous parts of Canada. Major cities like Vancouver, Montreal, Lethbridge, not Lethbridge, a small town, but Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto are getting impacted. New provincial governments are coming up with now new local restrictions and lockdowns to control the situation. But the second and third wave has been even worse compared to the first wave. And our health systems are now overflooded. We are down to 95 to 98% of the health occupancy and beds being covered. So what's challenging is, like, if the infection does not go down in the next couple months before Christmas, it will be quite a serious situation for the government and the health department to handle, because it's spreading. They opened the school and the universities, particularly schools in many provinces, and little kids who are coming were getting infection and bringing them back into their family. And as Canadians too, were not very cooperative in many cases in following the quarantine rules and stuff. And there was free movement, going into bars and attending parties. So the awareness of the level that should have been implicated in Canada was not very efficient enough. But sociologically, the government did come up with a great dole packages because the economy has been hit hard. Canada has been having trouble with US, Canada, China, and India with trade imbalance and export-import rules. And many countries have limited Canadian exports, particularly China, India, and United States, that impacted Canadian agriculture with overproduction and not finding appropriate market to sell them. So there has been a downturn of the economy. Small companies have frozen. Unemployment has been going high. Both governments, provincial and the federal, always try to cover this up and saying the situation is not bad. But from the ground level, where people lose job, situation does not look very good. Of course, the Canadian government has come up with many economic doles to help out people. It's a very socialistic country, and came up with a lot of packages to help the industry, individual citizens.
Basu, I'm sorry,
but still, it's the limitation and stretch.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but 2 minutes.
Sure.
Left.
Yeah, I understand. 2 minutes. Thank you, Sanghamitra. So there has been, I would say, a fluctuation of trust and mistrust for the government of Canada. And it includes both the government and the federal government, both the federal and the provincial government, is because what we found out was that everyone tried to handle this on their own. There was a lack of coordination between the federal, territorial, and the provincial government, and politics kicked in very badly, in the sense that various political parties wanted to take credit out of these grim situations, showing that they are the best in controlling. But what happened was that this lack of coordination, communication, and lack of comprehensive rules and restriction impacted Canadian economy severely. So there has been, when economy was failing and the government has been providing doles, there was support from the people. But I would suggest that overall, there has been a lack of faith in the government in not being handling the situation with really iron hand in the beginning. They were so soft and handled the situation with kid gloves that now the situation has been turning worse. Our health department is warning that if it continues a little bit longer, our health infrastructure will crash like Spain and Italy. So they are trying to set up artificial satellite hospitals and emergency medical transfers and stuff. Senior citizens are worst impacted. Many senior homes had like 400 inhabitants. Almost 90% of them have died during those infections. Families were deeply impacted because you are not allowed to meet your senior citizen member if they were in those houses. They've been transferred to safe houses, but still there is death toll, not maybe as high as in other countries, but still Canada's population is pretty low. So the rate of infection is high and we are struggling to balance out and flattening the curve. Thank you. I'll restrict myself to this point and will be happy to take any questions if anyone has. Once again, thank you so much for providing me this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Basu. It was very well expounded that in Canada, the situation is really bad and Canadians are losing trust in the current administration. That the government failed to provide a comprehensive guideline. Maybe that was one of the main crucial issues which led to the run up to the current state of affairs. Thank you so much, Professor Basu, once again. If any panelists have questions for Professor Basu, please go ahead.
I have one, if that is all right.
Sure.
I have to say that I'm particularly ignorant of the Canadian situation at the moment. I don't know why, but is there evidence that there has been a loss of faith in the government? Or, I mean, are there polls at the moment that tell us what the support or not support of the federal government is in Canada?
Well, the situation was not so bad in the beginning, because it's a very vast country with a lot of geographical isolation, the infection didn't spread so fast in the beginning in the first round, but because of the mishandling of the situation, it spread. And like opinion polls, there is no election right now in the next 3 years, but the opinion polls that are coming up is showing lack of faith on the Trudeau government, and it's a minority government. It does not have the ability to take a lot of important decisions, and there has been a lack of cooperation between the parties. It's a political crisis has been going on in Canada. There is a province-wise segregation of people's preference for various political parties in Canada. There is not a two-party system. Canada is a multi-party system, and there are pockets of supporters of various political parties across the provinces. And I believe that the provincial government did not cooperate with the federal government, and the federal government failed also to being a minority weak government to provide comprehensive plans for an all Canada policy that should be followed. They left it up to people, for their quarantines in the beginning part. So, I mean, people appreciated it in the beginning, but then they realized that there should be a restriction and enforcement of strong lockdown laws, which is happening right now. But we have covered that, crossed that golden period where they could have covered it and brought it under control. Although I mentioned that the world-class facility of medical things are available in Canada, but they are stretched under the present conditions. So definitely, whenever people are stressed, there is a lack of faith on the government, but the government is not challenged right now because there is no immediate polls. No by-polls are being held right now under the present situation, but I doubt that the Liberal government will be able to hold out in the next election, and there may be a coalition government because it's a multi-party system and people are so divided and angry about the government's reaction and handling the situation. There could be a hung parliament down the line in the new normal, And Canada has to evolve as a new country, like being dependent on US 24/7 for all trade supplies and not looking beyond and settling partners around the world is a weakness in the Canadian system. And the country is paying heavy toll right now for that. And we have been talking about this for long, but most governments have been dilly-dallying on taking rigorous policies. Sometimes you have to be a little harder to prevent for a long-term benefits. But Canada believes, most governments here believes in the sweeping, challenging problems under the carpet and on doing appeasement things to make people happy by doing small doles, but they're not looking at the long-term picture. So of course there is anger and mistrust among the people. Or most opinion polls that are showing that Trudeau's popularity is going down. And he's already not being liked upon by a lot of people. His popularity went up a little bit when he was handing out doles, but the government cannot keep on sustaining an entire nation based on government subsidies. So, and since the infection is spreading fast, senior citizens are worst impacted, and our economy is devastated through this process, and he has not been handling international issues pretty professionally and diplomatically. We are worried about the worst. So hopefully the country will get out of this deep slumber, and the new normal means a new beginning for Canada. Canada needs to change its policies, needs to look beyond US and establish big trading partners across the world, not being dependent on 2 or 3 suppliers or export importers. That's impacting the country. We were even running short on PEPs and other basic infrastructure and ventilators during like the middle time crisis. They do not even have enough ventilators now right across the country. And they haven't been able to build up the infrastructure during that golden period. So it's a crisis time. Sorry to say, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Professor Basu? Okay, then we'll move on to Professor Martin.
Thank you so much.
I have one question. I'm sorry.
Please go ahead.
Please.
Yeah, sir, I would like to ask you about the employment situation in Canada. I mean, because everywhere throughout the world, pandemic has affected the employment rate. So in Canada, what it is actually the situation?
Like for the government employees, because it's under unions and stuff, there hasn't been much cuttle down of the jobs, but there are no new advertisements. So there is no new influx into the job system. It's the private industry that has been impacted mostly, and particularly there are a lot of small-scale industries, farming operations. Agriculture is a huge industry in Canada, and it has lots of smaller units and labor needs. So, for example, every summer there used to be an influx of laborers coming from other countries like Thailand, Mexico, where they get a 3-month visa to work in Canada during the summer, during the various farms and other industrial areas. This hasn't been happening. Canada is a huge resource-based country, and there is less of industries and more of a resource-based selling to other countries. So like lumber, fresh water, whatever, Canada soils those resources, gold and diamonds and all kinds of mineral utilizers. But many companies, because the lack of the demand has gone down, so people at down the level, like, those who are doing mining at the very bottom level, or those agricultural workers at the very bottom level, there has been less demand for workers. And what I feel is 2020 was still okay, but there is not much, export orders or for Canada to supply in 2021. So 2021 will be even worse, because now, as you can see, the demands for many products have gone down. So they have to cut down on temporary employees. So those who do part-time jobs, those who are seasonal workers, those who are migrant workers, those who are immigrants, new immigrants to Canada, who do not have enough high education and skills now to blend into the high-tech jobs, are the worst impacted. They are the worst hit. So down the ladder of the economy is the worst hit.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
and thanks for the
very
paper.
much appreciated. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Professor Martin, would you please like to start your presentation?
Thanks. And thanks for hosting the event as well. So I don't have a PowerPoint slide either. So this presentation is based on a sort of broader project that I've been involved in, just written something on policing during the pandemic. So what I'm interested in is mainly protest policing and the criminalisation of protest policing that's occurred across the world. I'm also interested in the policing of everyday life. So in places like Victoria and New South Wales, that often involves the use of fines to sort of regulate and control populations and so forth, which I'll talk about. In terms of, so I haven't really thought about it before in terms of trust, really. So I suppose in relation to trust, what my research in this area, such as it is, relates to is issues to do with trust in the government, trust in law enforcement and the legal system and the justice system, and also sort of distrust as well, distrust in sort of experts and science and things like that, which I think that the pandemic generally has given rise to, or reinforced at least. So states are talking about, being guided by the science, meaning that, they don't necessarily have to make decisions based on the science. They don't have to follow the science, but they can be guided by it. For me, one of the overwhelming things that's kind of come out of the COVID situation is the turning on its head of some of the tenets of neoliberalism. It's the idea that the state should be sort of rolled back and privatisation should be the main sort of organising force in society. Some of the things that have occurred around that have been sort of breaches of hotel quarantine, for example, as we know in Melbourne, based on issues to do with private security, which to my amazement still seem to figure quite largely in the sort of running of hotel quarantine in Australia. So what a lot of the pandemic has done is it's reinforced a sort of a sense of the state, the importance of the state, the importance of state regulation, the importance of state oversight and provision in terms of healthcare and sort of unemployment furlough schemes and things like that. So what politicians have done is they've kind of had to straddle this sort of walk this fine line and balance, state intervention and personal responsibility, and particularly in liberal democratic societies, they've had to, in a sense, kind of some of the more libertarian politicians like Boris Johnson, for example, in the UK, have had to set aside their sort of more libertarian tendencies and sort of do a bit more state intervention. And so that's and at various points, they've been more interventionist than others. Obviously, when infection rates rise, the intervention increases. When infection rates lowers, however, there is much more emphasis on personal responsibility. So one of the things that I'm interested in terms of policing, self-policing even between citizens, is degrees of trust that operate in everyday life when politicians have eased lockdown measures and citizens are more inclined to, they're responsibilized in Foucauldian terms. What are some of the consequences of amongst the citizenry of more responsibilized sort of measures that are instituted by liberal democracies? So one of the things I've written about in the chapter that I've written, sorry, somebody's got their mic on there. One of the things I'm interested in is, in the paper that I've written, the chapter that I've written, is this this distinction between sorry, I was a bit distracted there. So the sovereign citizen, so people who in Australia, that's been sort of people turning up to hardware stores, not refusing to wear masks and saying that it breaches their civil liberties and constitutional rights and all the rest of it, because, and this happens in the US as well, by wearing a face mask. And so these people are dubbed sovereign citizens. They're highly individualized sort of responses to the pandemic. Many of their actions are essentially quite selfish and go against sort of the broader kind of health concerns and health issues. on the other hand, you have this sort of other group of people called citizen cops, who are sort of people who take it upon themselves to tell fellow citizens off for not following the rules and things like that. And I think one of the things that's interesting in the pandemic is, one of the things that's highlighted actually is human beings' inability to follow rules often, including politicians. So recently we've had New South Wales Premier who herself has not followed the rules. And of course, we've got examples in the UK as well. Dominic Cummings, an SNP MP, an SNP, Scottish National Party MP, who went to Parliament and took a train home knowing that she was infected and refusing to resign. To this day, I still don't think she's resigned. Of course, these sorts of things undermine trust in government, undermine trust in politicians and so on and so forth, that, to an extent weren't really there in massive amounts already. And in between the sort of sovereign citizen and the citizen cops, you also have this sort of sense also where states are devolving responsibilities to police for things that police really don't have resources to do or don't have training or even background in. So, in London, for example, police were expected to operate in partnership with shopkeepers in policing face mask, face covering rules and things like that. Police said they couldn't do it without themselves. So you've got this sort of, in a sense, a democratization, I suppose, of responsibility. I must write that phrase down just before I forget it, because I've just thought of it. A democratization of responsibility in a sense. Now, one of the problems in terms of policing is, and this doesn't necessarily go to trust, but there's been a few problems identified with policing and this sort of rebirthing of what's called social police, where police are not only concerned about and charged with discharging criminal justice, but they're also in charge of sort of more sort of social aspects of life, like regulating health and so on and so forth. Historically, that's not been something that's been historically, that's something that police have been involved in. But what we've seen with the COVID situation is that some of the problems that arise when states charge police with looking after oversight over a social and health crisis. So you've got issues, for example, that are perennial around policing anyway, of sort of racial profiling, for example, of people of colour wearing face masks are more likely to be targeted by police. The targeting of marginalised communities and the over-policing of marginalised communities, which is something that has happened prior to the COVID situation. So that lowers trust amongst those populations. In Victoria, for example, there were tower blocks, which were places where many sort of marginalised people lived and were already suspicious of the police. The issuing of fines as well has not been something that has been uniformly done by the police. Location data in Australia shows that across New South Wales and Victoria, there is no correlation between infection rates and the issuing of fines. So fines tend to be more disproportionately issued in lower socioeconomic areas than in affluent areas, even though the affluent areas have more infection rates. And this kind of goes to trust in police. Protests as well. Certain police tactics are used that could actually increase harms. So an increased infection rate, so the spraying of tear gas where people have to take their masks off, the mass arrests of people, which means that more people are in close quarters and potentially can spread the virus. The other thing that I wanted to just hook into as well in terms of thinking about the way that the citizenry kind of interact amongst some of the COVID restrictions is relates to what Dr. Zajdow talked about in terms of anime. One of the things we've seen in Australia and we've seen it elsewhere as well is this sort of panic buying. And often the politicians will come on the radio or whatever and say, "Oh, this is very un-Australian. You know, we're all fighting with each other." And so there were some YouTube clips that were loaded up, social media clips that were loaded up onto YouTube of people literally fighting in supermarkets over toilet roll. You know, people were saying this is un-Australian, whatever un-Australian means, which as an English person who's been living here for 15 years, I've still never really been able to work out what it is. There's a sort of myth around what is and what is not Australian, I think. But yeah, that goes, I think, to that sort of idea of this sort of, which contradicts what you were saying previously, actually, about cohesion and collectivism. I think there's actually, in some respects and in some quarters, there's been division. And I do think that there's a division which goes to a lack of social trust between citizens, if we think about that spectrum of the COVID cop and the sovereign citizen.
Professor Martin, I'm sorry to interrupt, but 10 minutes are over. You have 2 minutes left.
Okay, good, thanks. So it's a bit rambling, but the conclusion really is of the paper that I've written is that I wanted to sort of compare this balancing exercise that states and governments have done around state intervention and citizen rights and so on and so forth with the 9/11 situation, and think about it in sort of, because one of my backgrounds is sort of social and legal studies, think about it in relation to laws, you know, whether laws are seeping into other areas that they might not necessarily have a place in. There has been discussion in legal quarters around the sort of, you know, the permanence of these sorts of measures. In the area of protest and the right to protest, for example, courts in New South Wales have talked about how the right to protest has been suspended, but it hasn't been extinguished, which is probably is the case. Yeah, and so that's really, I've sort of opened it up a bit broader in what I've written, but I think I'll leave it there in terms of what I've had to say and open it up to questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Martin. This presentation basically dealt with two kinds of pandemic policing. One is by the state agent of police and the other by citizens, by the citizen cop. Thank you so much for your presentation. Any panelist wishing to ask a question to Professor Martin may please go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for this presentation, Professor Martin. I had just one query, which is like, if you can kindly tell me like about the marginalized communities you were saying that among them, the trust has reduced, if I'm not wrong. So in what ways the marginalized communities have been affected due to pandemic in Victoria, if you can, Victoria or any other regions which you want to focus. So if you can just give in brief, like a glimpse of the situation. That's it.
Oh, despite what Professor Kriesberg said at the beginning, I think that the situation in Australia would be no different to anywhere else in terms of the people who are affected by the pandemic. It's largely, you know, disproportionately more marginalised and lower socioeconomic class group, socioeconomic groups. As I said, in terms of the issuing of fines, you know, it's sort of business as usual in terms of the way that the police are policing the pandemic. I don't really have sort of fine-grained, detailed sort of statistics around all this stuff, though, to be honest. And there was a lot of disquiet, for example, when Victoria imposed more or less an overnight lockdown on a series of tower blocks in metropolitan Melbourne. Because that was, you know, there were people who were, you know, residents were sort of part of sort of marginalised communities and so forth. But, you know, it's no different, I don't think, here than anywhere else. You know, and part of the issue with private security that's come up, not only in Victoria, but also more recently in South Australia, is the idea that, you know, people that work in private security, that's not enough. They don't earn enough in order to get by, so they have to have other jobs. So there was, you know, in South Australia recently, where somebody's working private security in hotel quarantine and also working in a pizza shop. which, you know, adds to a whole series of different sort of questions and issues around, well, you know, where should we quarantine people? There's been talk of quarantining people outside of urban centres in Australia because we have lots of space here to do that, even offshore on places like Christmas Island. So, but in terms of the specifics, I couldn't, with any kind of degree of confidence, provide you with a picture. Sorry.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any more questions for Professor Martin? Any more questions for Professor Martin? Okay, then we'll move on to Professor Alminda's presentation. Professor Alminda Fernandez, you may go ahead and
Hi. Yes, thank you. So it has been a very interesting talk since the last hour, 1 hour. And at this point, I'm going to present to you about the COVID-19 in Philippines. So can you see my screen now? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry. So the Philippine COVID-19 cases under community quarantine. So as shown on the screen, we are now on the second most cases in Asia and 25th most cases globally, but with 110 million population around the globe, so it's not much of a worry. So as you can see on the figure here, since October 31, from 380,000 plus to, as of yesterday, to 421,000 plus. There's about 40,000 difference in just about less than a month. And although the active cases is just 26,000 plus, and total death increased to 8,000, and the recoveries, however, also increased to 386,000. And that's quite good for now, with only a case fatality rate of 121.90% in Philippines. So as you can see, the cases is scattered around the country, with much cases on the capital region. It's in Luzon, and followed by the second main land, Visayas, and Mindanao. It's where I am here in Davao City. So with the cases, there's about more than 50% case in men compared to women, and highest in the ages between 20 to 30 years old. And as you can see on the graphs there, the cases has been increasing since March, that we started the lockdown for 3 months. And so the community quarantine slows down the spread of COVID-19. And as you can see here, the timeline, we had an incidence actually as early as January, but we started the enhanced community quarantine. It's in other terms, it's our lockdown, at early as March 15 in the National Capital Region, in Manila, and the rest of the Luzon region, I mean. And so it has been it has not increased so much until we had on May 16 we had the modified ECQ. So it's not so tight anymore, and we have another enhanced community quarantine on June 16 on the Visayas region, as it increased its cases. But now the highest increase actually is on the months of August, as we have now a Luzon community quarantine, we call as modified enhanced community quarantine. And although we have been increasing, but not much as in other areas. So we actually have quarantine classifications, and the ECQ, or the enhanced community quarantine, is just the lockdown, wherein there is no movement in all status, and as well as the very minimum economic activity, no transportation at all, and of course the classes are suspended. And in this modified ECQ, there is already limited movement for services and for work, and the manufacturing processing plants up to 50% workforce only, and is limited to transportation only for essential goods and services, and still suspended classes. And on the third stage, we have GCQ, or General Community Quarantine, wherein the movement is also limited, and the operation of the government offices is increased to 75% workforce, as well as the transportation. And we already started flexible learning arrangements. And on the modified general community quarantine is the permissive socioeconomic activities with minimum public health standards, and it is where we are now. So the social trust in the Philippines is completely a government control. And so this is what actually happens on the lockdown, or we call enhanced community quarantine. So at that time, only the health workers are allowed to work, and if and only walking or biking is allowed, and no public transportation. And in terms of travel in and out of the country, um, the overseas Filipinos can return back to Philippines anytime, with of course 14-day quarantine if they coming from a very high risk countries like Hong Kong, Macau, and other China, and also home quarantine for those in less risk countries. And still, if you go, you can still go out, but if it's no for partying, and no coming out as tourists. And along the community, it's only actually the one who's it's only one per household member who can go out for groceries, and it's completely controlled by the we call it the barangay communities. And also the establishment that are only open are those that are under the supermarkets, groceries, and drugstores, and also banks, and also the police, air force, and personal health care, and the media. And the rest are not, especially the high risk, the 60 years and above. And also you have to always have documents with you if you go out. And although the food distribution is not hampered, and in fact it is not one of the prohibited times. And for establishments, only the basic needs and establishment are allowed to open, while hotels are not. So I was caught under this very period of time, wherein during the lockdown for 3 months in Philippines, I was stuck in Cebu because I came from overseas, and I really have to lie in order to go for a hotel that I'm not coming from the overseas. So it was really a difficult experience for me. So the government sectors also are allowed to work, but in a work from home scenario, and we call it skeletal force, wherein you are only allowed like once a week or 3 days a week. And as usual, there is no travels or even conferences with big population of people. And because some of the establishments were not allowed to open, so only the very important agencies in the government are allowed to work, and with a restricted time. So the private, however, cannot terminate their employees, but they can only give salaries if they are open. So no work, no pay. So it's been a difficult time. And although we have controlled the increase of cases of COVID, however, our economic status was a threat. And so we have received, however, from the government, a social amelioration packages, especially for the very needy. So again, under the next stage, which is modified enhanced community quarantine, all the public transportation are not allowed except for those for the health workers, and only the private companies and the private establishment with their own shuttle who can bring to and from their workers at the workplace and at home. And the now normal, the modified general community quarantine is what we have now, with minimum health standards as following in the house personally, and also in the establishment at workplace. So it's been really a part of our lives now, and the only persons who are allowed to go out are only ages 21 to 60 years old. And once again, you're allowed for exercise, but then you have to have no contact and with a 1 to 2 meters social distance, and no mass gathering more than 50%. And although the private and public work arrangement is ongoing already, and also classes, but modular classes for the high school and below, and for colleges and up, are now online.
Professor
So
Fernandez, Professor Fernandez, I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but you have 2 minutes left.
Yes, thank you. And so this is now the new normal look. This is what you can see in the jeepneys. It's a famous public transportation in the Philippines, and in the bus, and also in the MRT or train station. And we are being monitored through a QR code. So that's what we have as contact tracing. And so because of the previous lockdowns we had, the economy fell for the first time in 29 years. So it's been like in negative 7.3% growth of economy, GDP, according to Asian Development Bank. And so thank you very much for listening. And also thank you for the financial aid from that we receive in behalf of my country from all over the world. So thank you, and once again.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon.
Her presentation talked about the Filipino government's demonstrated capability in tackling the pandemic. As a result, one could understand the social trust that people had in government due to the comprehensive government actions, which focus on border policing, containment zones, and detailed quarantine rules, and even more. Thank you once again. Any questions from panelists for Professor Fernandez? Please go ahead. Any questions for Professor Fernandez from panelists? Please go ahead. Seems like there are no questions for you, Professor Fernandez. Thank you once again. We'll move on to the next.
Thank you.
we'll move on to the next speaker, Advocate Basu. Advocate Basu, you may please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Sanghamitra. Good morning, and thank you for giving me this brilliant opportunity. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. We know that the trust is reposed and power is shared. The interplay of trust and power is an essential concept of giving birth to democracy. Today, our country, India, is guided by the one supreme law, that is Constitution. All authorities, including the Supreme Court of this country, are working under the Constitution and not over it. The Indian Constitution inaugurates the pursuit of four sovereign virtues, namely rights, justice, development, and governance. Now, today's deliberation on whether the faith of the public on the government has eroded due to its response to the COVID-19 pandemic should first of all entail a discussion on the various legislative measures that were put to use for mitigating the spread of the pandemic. I must tell you, without any hesitation and with deepest humility, that unquestionable faith and trust to our government is a kind of impediment towards the growth of sensitive, vibrant, and cerebral citizenry in the country. Because it is just not like a faith without evidence. So today, when I talk about my country, when I talk about my city and village, I must tell you that at the outset, it is important to mention that even though two national health bills were introduced in the parliament, neither of the two was ultimately promulgated or received presidential assent. Most important, what follows is that at present, India has no overarching health legislation that provides for pandemic response measures. In the absence of such overarching legislation, the government of India and the respective state governments had largely relied upon two acts, namely the Pandemic Act 1897 and the second, the Disaster Management Act 2005. And it is known to everyone in our country that the Epidemic Diseases Act 1897 was enacted with the aim to better prevent the spread of plague, which originated in Bombay, now known as Mumbai, in September 1896. It is a very old act, and it was promulgated with the aim of better prevention of the spread of dangerous epidemic. And this 123 years old contains only 4 sections. Irrespective of the act's antiquity and extreme brevity, its provisions have been consistently utilized in an attempt to thwart the spread of the extremely dangerous and highly contagious COVID-19 virus. At this juncture, it is necessary to mention that the then legislatures responsible for promulgation of the Act of 1897 were steadfast in assuring the brevity of the Act. So much so that none of the sections of the Act define the term epidemic disease. Now, this is an incomplete legislation having absence of the contemporaneous tone, because today, only through this legislation we cannot combat this present epidemic which has claimed many lives. The reading of Epidemic Acts 1897 makes it evident that it fails to strike a balance between the powers conferred upon the central and state governments during an epidemic and the rights of the citizens. And not only that, it goes without saying, in a democratic country such as India, even during a pandemic, that whatever may be the situation, howsoever difficult it might be, due recognition must be provided to individual autonomy, liberty, and privacy. More importantly, the Act does not lay down the requirement of any standard and safety whatsoever to be ensured by the government in order to protect the healthcare officials, doctors, and other medical staff from the perils of infection. These are the inadequacies which we must address. Now, the Disaster Management Act was promulgated by the Indian Parliament in 2005 to mandate an apparent legal invocation. The Disaster Management Act, the central government on the 14th March 2020 declared the novel coronavirus of 2019 as a notified disaster, which causes a critical medical condition on pandemic situation. The particular provision of the Act sets out the aspects of such a plan. It is to deal with measures to be taken in mitigation and to address preparedness and capacity. Another section mandates the state authority to lay down guidelines for providing standard of relief. Now, the definition of the epidemic has not been also defined in this 2005 legislation. Second, it empowers the state executive committees and the district authority to control or restrict the movement of vehicular traffic or people from or within a vulnerable or affected area, and to take any measures that may be warranted by such a situation, among others. Additionally, directions can be given to government departments on taking such steps and measures for rescue, evacuation, providing immediate relief, saving lives. This Act also speaks about, and it permits the central government to take such measures as coordinate the work between the various authorities and government departments, deployment of military forces, and other matters to secure effective implementation, among others. It is evident that under a logical understanding of the statutory phrasing and absence of any linkage with Epidemic Disease Act, we come to that conclusion that the Act has not been enacted by Parliament for combating pandemics. Such conclusion is apparent through two separate understandings. First, notwithstanding legislative intent, after textually interpreting specific provisions of the DM Act, that is Disaster Management Act, which address healthcare responsibility of federal and state responders, we have found that the Act only imposes healthcare obligations in respect of providing healthcare services in disaster-affected areas by the state executive committees, 59 district authorities, and 60 central government ministers and state government departments. Second, Vidhi Center for Legal Policy Project Fellow, Ms. Yogni Wak argues that even though the Epidemic Disease Act of 1897 grants unwritten and thus relatively unchecked enabling authority to speedily set up management systems required for a coordinated and concerted response from a legalistic standpoint, however, it is archaic, completely unprescriptive, and a colonial law that fails to meet contemporary health challenges, because we have said also, and she argues that because of the awareness of such failures, the central government has invoked the Disaster Management Act as it provides for an exhaustive administrative setup for disaster preparedness. The government has declared COVID-19 as a notified disaster, as I told you, for the purposes of assisting states' disaster relief fund in collective samples and procuring the certain instruments. The concern regarding is that not only does the letter, MHA letter provide any legal basis as to how the government can notify a disaster so as to invoke the application of the Disaster Management Act, and the Disaster Management Act itself has no provision for the central government to notify a disaster so as to invite an application of disaster management area. These are the incompleteness. And furthermore, the central government had, by an order, and this Act 2005 directed all employers to pay wages to their employees during the lockdown. Such an order was questionable, as it was prima facie without jurisdiction, because Act does not contemplate or authorize the central government to make such provision for the employees who work in a under a private employer. And ultimately, the Supreme Court of this country had stated the operation of the notification issued under this Act. Such order could only be termed as an eyewash and a tool of pretense that the government wants to look after the poor. This is a kind of a situation which depicts a picture of an ignorance, a conscious omission on the part of the government. The exercise of sovereign power through legislation, because the parliament is accountable to people. But in this form, the parliament, it is a clear picture of severe failure. That is my understanding of the situation, subject to correction. Another severe pain which we have received during this pandemic, that is the health of and the crisis of the migrant workers. The government did not find itself free from scrutiny in respect of its handling of the migrant worker crisis. In order to shed some light in this regard, it is important to mention that after a nationwide lockdown was announced with under 4 hours notice on March 24, lakhs of stranded workers tried to move out of large cities to somehow return to their villages. The Chief Minister of the Uttar Pradesh, one of the states of our country, who had provided 37 luxury buses to transport 1,800 Gujarati pilgrims from Haridwar to Ahmedabad at the behest of the Union Home Minister on that very day, tweeted on March 27, and that his government had arranged for 1,000 buses to transport UP workers stranded in Delhi and Gurgaon to their home villages from Ghaziabad. Thousands of stranded workers gathered at Anand Vihar and Kausamabi on March 28, where they were told that Delhi government would provide buses to drop them where the UP government's 1,000 buses were waiting. Similar scenarios were playing out in other states where millions of workers were stranded. At this juncture, the Union Ministry of Home Affairs had a change of heart and prohibited all interstate and inter-district movement of migrant workers, directing that they be brought back from wherever they might be and detained in the nearest quarantine facilities for a minimum period of 14 days as per standard health protocol. The March 29 order said nothing about what would happen to the stranded workers or their families after 14 days, but threatened that the district magistrate and senior police functionaries would be held personally liable for the implementation of these draconian orders. This portion I have read for you is an article titled "In the Supreme Court is a Thrall of Government," written by Chandra Udai Singh. Now,
Basu, I'm sorry to interrupt. You have 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you, Sanghamitra. I will be completed. I will complete this. As I said at the outset, that our country is guided by the Constitution of India. Constitution is the supreme law, and it is the only law. And no moral reading of the Constitution remains outside the linkage of human rights and human sufferings. That is what the jurist of our country has understood the Constitution. And I say there are certain things we must look into. That one of the most admirable goals of a democratic system in making decisions, while taking the interest of the majority into an account, there are certain measures. Good and reasonable decisions are not enough. It is implementation and effectiveness by the political leaders and the executives are very important. Executives of this country, they are one of the constitutional authorities. They are not like a domestic help or the shape of a hotel. They are serving the political leaders. They must understand the basic things, that they have independent existence under the Constitution. Our erosion of faith towards the political leaders and executives are very alarming. And we must know that democracy is not an evening tea party. It is often clashes of ideas and opinions. And we must take into account that in order to get a good government is not the only term. We must a sound and sensitive government, and which allows a climate of tolerance. That is what I have understood. Because of the brevity of time, I could not express my mind. It is my fault that I could not make myself prepared within the time. I'm sorry, and thank you to all of you for lending your ears to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Advocate Basu. From his presentation, it could be deduced that the central government's dependence on inadequate legislation, as well as the handling of the migrants during the pandemic, led to people's reduced faith in the central government. Thank you once again for your presentation. If any panelist wants to ask Advocate Basu any question, please go ahead. Any questions for Advocate Basu from the panelists?
No.
Yes, please go ahead. Professor Kriesberg, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm not, okay. I think your case is more extreme, but in all the cases, the governments take actions without very much public engagement. And I've been thinking about the possibility that in most cases, some more public engagement was feasible. Democratic governments have legislatures, and they might discuss what are the alternatives, or having forums where various interest groups are represented. And they talk, what are the alternatives? And in the end, there may be a governmental decision, but everybody will feel that their point of view has been heard at least, and that might build more solidarity and acceptance, because every government seems to have trouble with resistance at some point to what some others have decided to do. That's more an observation, but perhaps it strikes the thought about what alternatives might be operative.
Advocate Basu, would you like to make a quick yes, please go ahead.
Professor Kriesberg, yes, I bow down to your observation. It is one way of looking at the problem. But in India, what we have faced, that is not only the implementation of the law, but also the lack of pragmatic approach in making the law. Because if the parliament is unable to understand the contemporaneous tone, and if it is not understanding the situation of the country or the present time, because 1897 there was a situation, and after 123 years, this is a new situation. It is not that they could not anticipate. The question is inability to foresee the situation after analyzing and assessing the past experience. That is a providence, that is the wisdom, that is the province of wisdom, I must say, subject to correction, Professor Kriesberg. But ultimately, because of the inability to foresee the situation and to lack of timely legislation, the common men of this country had to suffer. Although our government has made certain steps which are commendable also, but they should have been more proactive. The and I must add one thing: in India, in Calcutta, the celebration of festival is one of the most important factors, and curtailment of this festival is generating an unpopular thing, and every government is afraid of that, very much apprehensive. But the Calcutta High Court, the division bench of the Calcutta High Court, the Honorable Justice Sanjeev Banerjee and Honorable Justice Odijit Banerjee, they have come up with a courage, because sometimes people say that court often acts with an agent of injustice. But in our country, because of the existence of the brilliant judges and the brilliant constitution, ultimately they have taken up the people from worse suffering, because they have controlled the masses to be gathered, and ultimately they have implemented the law, and it is a kind of judicial legislation which ultimately obeyed the people to maintain social distancing and all other safety measures. The High Court has laid down the law during this 2020 Puja celebration at the time in Calcutta, in West Bengal, I must say. And this is a unique judgment. I must express my mind to you. This is a thing, and the court came up with certain modalities, and that has laid down a correct law according to my humble understanding of the law. And in a situation like this kind of judgment, we are welcoming this, because in lack of proper legislation, in lack of proper political executive and executives, this kind of judgments, which ultimately compels us to maintain a correct and proper lifestyle. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any more questions for Advocate Basu? Any more questions for Advocate Basu? Okay, thank you so much, Professor Kriesberg.
Sanghamitra, may I seek your kind leave, if you kindly permit me, because I have one court case I have to attend at 11:30. If I can manage, I'm trying. I will get back to. I will come back. If you kindly give me some time, because I have a professional commitment. If you kindly, if it is possible, subject to kind sanction of all the speakers and the panelists. I don't know whether it is proper for me, but still I have disclosed my mind. It will start at 11, 11:15.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here with us. We really liked your presentation. Thank you once again.
Deeply obliged.
Yes. We'll now move on to the next speaker. We have Dr. Sebastian. Dr. Sebastian, please go ahead.
I want to share my slides here. So is it visible now?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. Okay, so 1 second. All right. So once again, thank you for inviting me here on this platform. So it was a great sharing session where we saw various domains of political practices across different countries. Now, focusing the attention to Singapore now and talking about public trust and political practices during COVID. So the objective of my presentation here today, my slides are not moving. Okay. Is how government's competency influenced social trust and compliance in Singapore during COVID. Now, competency could be defined in terms of its capacities. Now, capacities could be fiscal capacity, it could be operational capacity and policy capacities, okay? And then we talk about the reliability in delivering these public services and anticipating new needs as well. So competency comprises of all these components, and how this competency allowed Singapore to gain social trust and compliance during this pandemic. Okay, so Singapore, as we know, is an East Asian developmental state, and it retains its legitimacy and credibility through performance. So it's also called performance legitimacy, and it accomplishes this performance legitimacy through socioeconomic goals, social and political stability, good governance, and economic growth. And this legitimacy of government has ensured a high level of socio-political trust among people, and various studies have supported the same argument. And along with trust, not just trust, Singaporean population has broadly exhibited a high level of compliance as well with the government's prevention and control measures. And it's evident everywhere. If you step out here, it's evident everywhere that most of them comply with government's prevention and control measures. Now, this performance legitimacy of the government was further enhanced by government's success in managing past crises and pandemics like the SARS outbreak in 2003 and the global financial crisis in 2008, and now the COVID pandemic too. Now, how are the initial days like in Singapore during COVID? So Singapore was one of the first ASEAN countries to take official cognizance of threat of COVID. It announced a ministerial task force to lead a national response and responded early and proactively to the signals received from China. However, over time, due to the rising infection rate, government had to announce a 2-month lockdown starting from April to June, and it was famously known as the circuit breaker. Studies also have shown that government has taken a lot of control measures like travel bans, contact tracing, compulsory mask wearing, social distancing, along with financial relief to businesses and households. Now, the issue of health and treatment of foreign migrant workers in dormitories definitely continues to be a subject of ongoing debates. However, it should also be brought to light that the mortality or the fatality rates still remain very low as compared to other countries of the world. Now, analyzing Singapore's response to COVID through different capacities of the government, and firstly focusing on the policy capacity. So Singapore being a very small island city of comprising of nearly 5.6 million people, and having a limited geographical size, it becomes easy for the government to monitor and restrict the movement of its people. So adding to this demographic and geographical advantage, Singapore, the high levels of political centralization in Singapore makes it easy to act quickly and ensure a high level of social compliance. Now, Singapore's experience in managing COVID can be mainly attributed to its efficient public administration system, so which comprises again of the public healthcare system and high levels of policy capacity, and also the experience it gained from controlling the SARS outbreak in 2003, which resulted in heavy investments in public healthcare system and medical R&D over time. So if you see Singapore's policy capacity, they are a result of an overtime effort. So it's a cumulative process of efforts over time. Now coming to the operational capacity of managing the COVID crisis. Now, how did government, what was the highlighting feature of operational capacity? It was its healthcare system, again, which is ranked one of the top in the world. And also the main feature of its availability of hospital beds and resources for treating these infected patients. However, even these fancy features and facilities turned out to be inadequate when large infection clusters erupted among the migrant workers, as all of us know. However, government quickly enacted upon it with measures and immediately segregated the healthy workers from the infected workers and rehoused the healthy workers into other facilities like schools, military camps, waiting public housing projects, so as to curb the further spread of the virus. Now, so this reflects that the availability of physical infrastructure is extremely crucial to ensure operational capacity while policy making. The second major feature of operational capacity while managing COVID was the ability to conduct extensive contact tracing, like my friend from Philippines, Alvinda, also pointed out. So Singapore also has similar digital contact tracing apps with high-tech technologies where we can do safe entries when we are walking in malls or hospitals or any place, public places we enter. So this enabled the government to quickly trace the immediate contacts of infected people, trace them, isolate them or treat them, and prevent the further spread of the disease. Now, having talked about the operational capacity as well as the policy capacity, so these are incomplete or they can't be functional. They can't, the projects can't be implemented if you don't have fiscal capacity. So this fiscal capacity was derived from the large national reserves of Singapore. In total, 4 budgets were introduced to meet the economic needs that may arise at different points of crisis in terms of ensuring business continuity. A lot of cash payouts were given to individuals and households, and workers' wages were subsidized to retain workers as well as hire workers even more in terms of job support scheme, in terms of COVID support grant, and lots of tax reliefs to businesses as well. Now, also on the fiscal capacity side, it also provided free COVID testing and medical care for its citizens, which ensured willingness from the public to be tested and seek medical care on time, since it's free, so they don't bother about the cost. So this brings me to the conclusion of this presentation. And so all through this COVID management experience, it has been observed that the role of public communication was played a very important role in ensuring compliance. There were clear and concise policy directions and advice delivered through traditional as well as social media on a daily basis, which helped gain social trust and thereby compliance among people. Also, the presence of these interdependent capacities, which are fiscal, analytical, operational, policy capacities of government, they resulted in lower levels of COVID-related fatalities, as well as minimal community transmission, with the exception of migrant workers, of course. So Singapore has actually provided a very good insight to policy capacities that can be used to deal with pandemics. However, given the Singapore's unique socio-political demographic context, the applicability of these lessons in managing COVID may be more relevant to smaller states or city level governments. So what I think. So that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sebastian. It was understood from Dr. Sebastian's presentation that public trust in government authorities fluctuated in Singapore. It showed how communicating the risk of pandemic and the measures taken by the government, like advising, tracking, testing, stimulus packages, etc., could help influencing trust and compliance. Thank you so much once again. Panelists, if you have any question for Dr. Sebastian, please go ahead.
Could I ask a question?
Yes,
yes,
please.
yes, Greg.
I'm just interested in Singapore being a city-state and a very densely populated one at that.
Right.
How does it, so how, for example, would it differ from, say, somewhere like New York City, which is probably just as densely populated, if not as densely populated? How is Singapore able to kind of combat the spread of the virus and stuff in ways that, say, for example, New York City wouldn't be able to?
Like I said here, the government was really proactive right from the start in terms of implementation. And also the fact that the government here is very centralized. So the proactiveness of government would be a major differentiating factor between, say, New York and Singapore. So how proactively, even though there were certain flaws with respect to anticipating migrant needs or migrant worker needs, but still the fact that it jumped into action and it actually provided solutions to those problems. And for example, in the migrant worker case, when this issue cluster broke, so this was the only prominent issue that was treated as a flaw in the policy making. So when this foreign worker issue broke, migrant issue happened. So these migrant workers were residing in a room of close to 20 beds in one room. So the first step was to take out the healthy workers from those places and rehouse them. And secondly, the beds and the capacities in these accommodations have been immediately reduced to maximum 10. And they have been given a lot of support and promises that their conditions would be different and very much different in the coming days, and it would be improved. So, yeah, the only difference that I find between, say, a state like a city like New York and Singapore would be how proactive the government is and how it responded, the responsiveness of government.
I think also possibly the fact that Southeast Asian nations experienced SARS, and also possibly that, say, for example, places like the UK, I know, originally were treating this as influenza or as kin to influenza. So those things might well be a factor as well.
Correct. Their past experiences have really taught them a lot of lessons. And like I mentioned in my presentation, they have done a huge investment in R&D, in medical care and public healthcare system, learning from their experiences from SARS. So SARS was actually a learning lesson for them. And so it was not immediate policy response. So this was a coordinated, cumulative response from the start. So, yes.
Thank you. Any more questions for Dr. Sebastian? Okay, thank you once again, Dr. Sebastian and Professor Martin. Now we'll move on to our next speaker, Professor Saha. Professor Saha, you may go ahead and start presenting.
Hi. Just yeah. So the presentation, so my paper's title is Understanding Social Trust and Rights of Tribal People During Pandemic in India. So the thing is that which I would like to say on the in the initial stage of the presentation is this, that tribal people as such in India, they have not been there have not been enough cases among tribal people or tribal communities, because usually these tribal communities are found in those places which are very much isolated from the urban areas. And what we see among the mainly whatever record has come out, because most of the record has not come out from the government side. So whatever record which we have got from the government side, so that record shows that basically that the COVID cases, maximum number of COVID cases have mainly taken place in the urban areas like metropolitan cities, like Calcutta, like Bombay, like Delhi. So these were the most important cities where a huge amount of, because of migrant workers, because of international travelers, so their COVID cases have taken place to a large extent. So the tribal population in India has been mainly affected because of the reason of lockdown announcement, because the tribal people are completely dependent, mostly the tribal workers, they are dependent on the urban areas. They are dependent on migration, and through migration work, through migration agricultural work, which takes place mostly in the populated villages, mostly in the populated urban areas, where they have to migrate from their places of isolation, and that is why that is how they have been affected. And also along with the announcement of lockdown, what has happened is that they have not been allowed, means the tribal people, they have been restricted for their movement in the forest areas as well. So these are certain, like on the stage only, I would like to say that these are the main reasons why tribal people have been affected, like indirectly. They have not been, maybe there have not been cases, a lot number of cases among the tribal communities, but they have been affected indirectly because of the lockdown which was announced in the country without any prior announcement or without any prior preparation from the government side. So now if we come to the presentation directly, so 10.45 crore tribal people who reside in India are at stake as a result of persistent backwardness, economic dependency, inequality in education, medical facilities, and nutritional status, and existing stigma due to lack of implementable policies since independence. These tribal communities mostly dwell on the procurement and sale of forest produce for their sustenance, and many other agricultural workers. They work mainly as agricultural laborers, and the produce which mainly takes place from the forest areas, which is called as the National Timber Forest Produce, which is NTFP, and the minimum forest produce, which is MFPs. So these have undergone a decline with the declaration of lockdown, and with the declaration of the closure of market due to the lockdown. So the production, MFP production, and their sale has reduced to a large extent, which has affected economically the tribal communities and the tribal people. Then the nationwide lockdown was announced in India on 24th March 2020, as it has already been told by Kallol Basu, that the lockdown was announced without any prior preparation, without any prior preparation from the central government as well as from the state governments also, because there was no prior preparation of how to deal with the lockdown or how to deal with the situation if the lockdown takes place. So countries like Australia, Costa Rica, New Zealand, and others have announced plans and schemes and specific specifically for the tribal rights during the pandemic, Costa Rica issued guidelines for prevention of the pandemic in indigenous territories. Like New Zealand introduced cultural practices which will help the indigenous population to cope with the pandemic and also maintain their traditional culture. The Ministries of Health in Colombia and Peru established the COVID-19 Bionational Committee to address the situation of the indigenous people in the living in the Amazon transborder areas. However, any such kind of policy or any such kind of program has not been introduced by the Indian government for looking after the tribal people or for taking care of the tribal people and their economic condition. So if we look at the infrastructural position of the tribal people, then that is also in a there's a very dire necessity of development among the tribal people, in the healthcare facilities, and also among the and also educational facilities and awareness among the tribal people. So ST women and men in the age group of 15 to 49 years who are affected with asthma is also higher in number than the SC and OBC people, which is the scheduled caste and other backward class people. And there is also high incidence of other diseases like asthma, diabetes, goiter, which is found more among the tribal population, among the ST population in India. There is very high incidence of tobacco addiction among the ST population. 26.3% of the ST women and 71.2% of the ST men are affected with tobacco addiction, which is highest in comparison to the other population in the same age group. Only 2.6% of the ST households have a member with health insurance. This is a very grave and a very like miserable reality that only 2.6% of the ST households have a member with high health insurance, which means that they do not receive any form of medical facility during the time of pandemic, during such crisis situation, which is like the pandemic situation or any other crisis or any other crisis which takes place during in such healthcare problems, right? So, and also along with this, if we see the healthcare facility which is present in India, especially in the rural areas, there is a huge shortage. There's a huge shortage of the sub-centers, the primary healthcare centers, and there's community healthcare centers. So basically what is situation in India is that we have these sub-centers, primary healthcare centers, and community healthcare centers, which work at the rural areas or which work at the village level. And mainly the hospitals which are available in the urban areas and municipalities, the government hospitals and private hospitals, they are mostly inaccessible to the tribal communities and also to the rural area, to the rural population who are coming from the marginalized sections of the villages. So, and as a result of lockdown and as a result of the complete closure of transportation, which happened mainly in the month of March, April, May, June, July, completely. So these 4 to 5 months, there was no form of transportation from the rural areas to the urban areas in India. There was no train transportation, there was no bus transportation, there was no form of transportation, which ideally meant that if there is any problem in the rural area, if a person who is undergoing some problem in healthcare issue in a rural area, if the person have to go to the urban area for health checkup or for health facilities, then it was ideally impossible. And again, if we talk about the tribal people among them, awareness is so low that they would not at all come out of their community and also not come out of their isolated regions to go to the urban areas and access those medical facilities. Also, there's another problem, which is that is the economic capacity. The tribal people, the tribal population, they do not have the economic capacity to go to these medical places, to go to these private hospitals or government hospitals which are present in the urban areas to seek medical facility during such a condition. So we can see the numbers over here, and there's such huge amount of shortfall which is taking place in the public healthcare system in India. So And in order to recover, I think it is not possible to talk about the government at the moment, because this is a situation which has been taking place since 70 years. Even after independence, the situation has not improved. So within 6-7 months, it is not at all like thinkable, or it is not at all it is not at all acceptable to understand or to feel that the government will be able to bring about a drastic change in the public healthcare facility. Problems of healthcare facilities and the tribal areas. The problems is that these households, they are covered by only 2.6% of the household, ST households are covered by health scheme or health insurance. Distance to health facility, 44% of the STs, they have a huge distance from the health facility. Distance in the sense that they are mostly far away, they are mostly residing far away from basic healthcare facilities like basic primary health centers or the basic community health centers, because the tribal communities usually reside in very isolated areas where the public healthcare centers and community healthcare centers are not at all organized or not at all built. And at least one problem in accessing healthcare, 67% of the ST households that has been noted from the statistical profile of scheduled tribes, which has been published by Government of India, that 67% of ST households, they do not have awareness, there are several other problems of accessing healthcare facilities. So 74.7% of the STs opt for open defecation. 77.4% of the households do not have latrine facilities. Only 22.6% of ST households have latrine facility within their premises. 33.6% of the STs have to travel far away to get drinking water, and only 19.7% of the households have sources of drinking water within their premises. Along with lacking the availability of drinking water, 24% of the rural ST households and 16% of the urban ST households did not receive safe drinking water, according to the National Sample Survey Organization survey of 2008-2009. So even then the situation was like this, and it has not at all improved to a large extent currently. And given this statistics, or given this data, or given the situation, it is very difficult to understand, or it is very difficult to realize that how is it actually possible for the tribal communities to maintain social distancing when they have to travel far away for open defecation, when they have to travel far away for collecting drinking water. So it is very difficult to accept, or it is very difficult to think that they will be able to actually maintain the norms and policies of social distancing to a large extent. Along with this, majority of the tribal population, they depend on minor forest produce and non-timber forest produce, which is NTFP, a major source of economic sustenance and livelihood. In Dindigul district of Tamil Nadu, the Paliyar tribal youth dwell on honey as MFP.
Professor Saha, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, so I need to rush through. Actually, so the next few parts of presentation, what I have actually tried to mention is that, there are these different tribal groups who are being affected, and also these are also mainly there are PVTGs, that is particularly vulnerable tribal groups like the Baigas in Madhya Pradesh, who have reported several problems as a result of the lockdown. As a result of the lockdown, medical healthcare facility in the isolated tribal communities have been reduced. They have also, their economic capacity has also come to nil, because they are not being able to access the MFPs and NTFPs, which they usually sell in the market for their sustenance and livelihood. And also that the government has also not thought, maybe not even before, and even not at the situation, they have not thought how to bring about this medical or healthcare facility to provide this healthcare facility to the tribal communities. And on top of this, what they have done is that the central government has introduced a particular act, which is called as this Environment Impact Assessment Act. And according to that, they have revised this EIA Act, and without basically getting a majority in the parliament, without getting the majority of the parliament, they have already enacted this EIA, which has given the right to government to clear the forests, that is forests in the forest where the tribal people dwell. And initially, according to the Forest Right Act of 2006, it shows that it mentions that if there is any form of forest clearance required, then the village council has to be informed, because the village council is the lowest is the lowest organization or the government machinery which is in direct interaction with the tribal people. So the tribal people are informed through the village council, and with the help of this EIA, this changing of EIA without any majority support, the central government has taken this entire Forest Right Act in their hand. And recently, what has happened is that even I had the opportunity to move to go to Arunachal Pradesh, which is one of the tribal dominated areas. The entire region is completely under cutting off. There is rampant cutting of forest, which is going on to make national highways. And this deforestation is taking place without the consent of the tribal communities, which is also impacting on their economic sustenance as well, because they're completely dependent on the tribal, on the forest regions for their economic livelihood. So to a large extent, what I would like to conclude, because obviously I don't have much time, but there's a lot of examples from different tribal groups from different countries, which are from different states in the country, which has been reported. So I wanted to mention them. But yes, if there is any, if anyone wants it, then I can send it through email. But yes, so what I would like to say about this idea of social trust in pandemic is that I won't say that there's no complete social trust in the government, but I would like to say that this is a kind of an inevitable segregated kind of a social trust, in the sense it is inevitable because there is no other way out. I mean, we are wearing a mask, we are maintaining social distancing as far as possible. So we are trying to do those things which have been given like by the government, which have been framed by the government, by Indian Council of Medical.
Sorry to interrupt you. If you could wrap it up.
Yeah, I'll just
because we have to take questions from the audience as well.
Yes, surely. So Indian Council of Medical Research and all. But then also it is segregated because there are some communities who are completely trusting full-fledgedly in the government, but there are certain communities who don't have any faith on the government. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Saha. From a presentation, it could be discerned that the government, the way it imposed the lockdown, made the tribal population vulnerable, especially in terms of accessing affordable healthcare facilities and economically, and even more. If there are questions for Professor Saha from panelists, please go ahead. If there are questions for Professor Saha from panelists, please go ahead. Okay, then I will open the session to questions from the audience. If we come to the Q&A section, we see that there are two questions, one for Dr. Sebastian and one for Professor Kriesberg. We'll start with Dr. Sebastian. Dr. Sebastian, how would you like to answer this question? Answer live? Okay, great.
Yeah, I have opened my mic for this.
Okay.
So as we know that there has been the airline industry in Singapore has been massively hit, laying off many workers. And in an attempt for that, the Hong Kong-Singapore air travel bubble was started. But because of the sudden eruption of COVID cases in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong-Singapore air travel bubble couldn't last, but it just has got deferred. But if we see the demand for those people who opted for Hong Kong-Singapore bubble was too high, and we can definitely expect, as and when the situation is under control, we can definitely expect it in a future few weeks to or whenever the situation comes under control for this to resume. On the other hand, not just travel, in terms of tourism, etc., also government is doing a lot in terms of promoting tourism among the local community by allowing for staycations in hotels, by giving them vouchers. And also there's something called the cruise to nowhere, where people can travel, they cannot go to any port, but they can travel in the ship for 2-3 nights and come back to the Singapore port. So it's exclusively open for the Singaporean population. So government has been trying to upgrade through because travel and tourism being a massively hit industry. So it is trying in its best to come up with measures to promote as much as it can. And it can be seen to be improving in 2021, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have another question for Professor Kriesberg. Professor Kriesberg.
I think I just want to make sure, am I being heard?
Yes, yes, you can be heard.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
I think that Biden is making very clear that he will have a national policy and take some responsibility. I think the long-term emphasis on inequality, which the appointment of Yellen as Secretary of the Treasury is indicative, and on global warming are ways in which he can justify engagement for common problems, as well as dealing with COVID-19. Of course, now that the vaccines are coming in, that makes it seem more manageable. But the economy obviously has been damaged seriously, and I think he will be much more active to make sure that compensation is given in the first big program for support, which has been held up by the Republicans for reasons that they can't explain. They give no justification for not continuing to justify to provide aid for the people who have been impacted so dreadfully by the closing of the economy. So I'm very hopeful. He has a style which is soothing, and I think everybody, even his supporters, are tired. The jubilation in the streets when he was declared defeated was spectacular. And of course, it was even shared around the world. So I appreciate that from all of you. I'm sorry that we are such an object lesson of how not to proceed, but we have overcome, and I think we shall overcome in many other ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have one question. It's on the YouTube page, and the question is this. In the present circumstances, when Europe is reeling under second COVID-19 wave, and it is said that Hong Kong is now undergoing the fourth wave, then how new normal will work? It's a question, it's an open question. Any panelist can choose to answer it. Please go ahead. This question I've put in the chat.
One of the things I would say is, how do you define a wave? You know, I mean, it's and it goes to what was said right at the beginning by Professor Kriesberg. You know, different countries experience things differently. So recently in Australia, we had this notion of South Australia about to experience a second wave, but of course they never experienced a first wave. So partly there's a kind of an issue there with what is a wave and how it varies. But I think that, you know, we've all become experts, haven't we, around epidemiology and stuff. So, you know, for what it's worth, this is what I think. I'm talking. Sorry, family issues. Vaccines are obviously important. Management and learning around what has happened over the past 6 months. You know, the science has changed. You know, right at the beginning of the pandemic, we had, you know, Sir Patrick Vallance in the UK, who's the chief scientific officer, talking about, you know, herd immunity, you know, and there was also a lot of murkiness around what mask wearing could do and the efficacy of mask wearing and stuff. So I think as things change with, and obviously with the sort of potentially silver bullet of the vaccine, things will change. Sorry, I completely lost my train of thought because I had a family issue going on.
Thank you so much. Any more questions from the audience? Any more questions from the audience? You can either type it in Q&A, or if you choose to raise hand, then I can, you know, go ahead and request you to ask that question. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, there's actually one request from the audience, and it says that, is it possible to get the PowerPoint presentations shown by the eminent speakers? Now, I'm afraid here you will have to seek permission from the speakers themselves. If they are fine sharing their PowerPoint presentations, then no issues at all. But first you'll have to seek the permission of speakers themselves. It's 11:30 a.m. and in India time, 11:30 a.m. and I think it's 5 p.m. Australia time, AEDT time. We have covered this session in the stipulated time, and I'm very thankful to everyone, the panelists, the audience. Thank you so much for being part of today's session. Thank you a lot for making this session what it is. Thank you once again. Any closing remarks from any panelist, anything, you know, before we could just, you know, leave this session? Anything at all? Thank you so much. Everyone take care, stay safe. Thank you once again, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.